Hello and welcome to New Age Renaissance Man, the show about everything intellectual. I'm your host, Alex T.Q. Now, today we're going to talk about heroes and why having heroes is important to being an educated and successful individual, and especially an educated and successful Renaissance man. Now, our society is losing heroes. People are looking back on history with a very critical eye, and as a result, they're looking at historical figures we used to consider heroes now as flawed or even villainous. I think heroes are important to having an educated society, and that opinion comes largely from two very specific reasons. The first is that heroes provide a formula for understanding how to find success, especially for Renaissance men. And secondly, heroes inspire us to achieve greater and greater things. So we're going to talk about those two things and analyze why having heroes is very important as an individual and as a society. So let's just begin with that first idea that I brought up, that heroes provide the formula for understanding how to achieve success. Now, two of my personal heroes are Ben Franklin and Abraham Lincoln. I simply derive a lot of inspiration from these two gentlemen. I mean, they were exceptional people. They were people who defined their eras. You know, in the times that they lived, you look back on those times and you can't talk about history, especially American history, without bringing up the men Ben Franklin and Abraham Lincoln. So let's start off with Ben Franklin. I said that heroes provide the formula for understanding how to achieve success. So how does Ben Franklin do that for us? Well, first off, you should know that Ben Franklin wrote an autobiography. He didn't do that necessarily as an autobiography in the modern sense, with the idea of he sat down and decided, I'm going to write about every part of my life, so that everybody can hear about it, for the masses. So what he did instead was he just wrote some memoirs. He has he did 4 different times in his life, basically. And so you'll have this book that's separated into 4 different chunks in the 4 different times that he decided that, I'm going to write more of my memoirs, right? So he wrote this autobiography. It was put together and then it was sold and marketed as Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And it does tell the story of his life. So let's talk about the autobiography. The autobiography tells us how he gains independence, how he studies, his experiences building his business, because he had a print shop, and then it talks even about his personal relationships, talks about romantic relationships very briefly. It talks a lot about friendships. It talks a lot about business partnerships, and it's not just an account of his life, but in the midst of him talking about his life, he's giving us advice. He's saying, one of the biggest errors I've ever made was trusting this person. Here is why that was an error. Here is maybe how I could have avoided that. So Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography shows us his relationships, shows us his life experiences, and gives us advice. Family. He was a working class kid born into a working class family. He built himself up, though, and through building himself up, through his hard work and discipline, he was able to make something of himself, right? And the way he did that was not just through hard work, but through the right hard work. And part of that, like the big thing that he did, was read a lot. He talks about how if every free moment he had, he would use to read. And every spare dime he had, he would buy it use it to buy books, right? So what we learn from Benjamin Franklin is basically, if you're an educated Renaissance man, how to live your life, how to succeed as an educated Renaissance man. In fact, in the very beginning of his autobiography, he kind of almost playfully tries to deny that he is writing this autobiography, because back in that time, the idea that people would want to read about your life, it was considered very presumptuous. Unless you were somebody really, really accomplished, who was very, very admired, it was kind of viewed as almost a little arrogant. Like, why should I read about your life? And so Benjamin Franklin, at the very beginning of his book, kind of playfully insists, this is just for maybe my future, my descendants, in case they want to learn a little bit about my life. But, this is not, you don't have to worry about it. I'm not being arrogant here. I promise. This is just a little thing so that maybe you can avoid some of the same mistakes I did. So he tries to play it very low key. But in reality, what he's telling us there is that the exigence for his autobiography is to tell future generations about his experiences so that they can learn. Benjamin Franklin fully understood why heroes were important because they provide that formula how to achieve success. They teach us how to avoid the same mistakes. If you heed their warnings, if you listen to them, if you read about them, if you analyze and study them, if you philosophize about their lives, you are going to take something out of that. You're going to learn something that you can use to achieve better things in your life, right? So that is Ben Franklin. That is what he teaches us. That is how he provides a formula for understanding how to achieve success. Now let's talk about my other hero, Abraham Lincoln. Now, I mentioned Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, which, by the way, will be in the description of this video or podcast or wherever you may be listening. So if you want to find it, there'll be a link to Amazon where you can get the book. But the other book that I want to talk about is in regards to Abraham Lincoln. And the book is Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals, which is all about Lincoln's life. That book will also be in the description. It talks about Lincoln's life experiences. It talks about his approach towards loved ones, relationships, very similar to Benjamin Franklin's biography. It talks about his relationship with his colleagues. Lincoln had a very interesting relationship with his colleagues. In fact, the premise of Team of Rivals, the reason it's called Team of Rivals is because Abraham Lincoln, after he won the presidential primary in 1860 for the Republican Party, he decided to make his other three competitors, Edward Bates, Salmon P. Chase, and William Henry Seward. Those three guys. So Salmon P. Chase, then Bates, and then Seward. He makes them all part of his cabinet. He makes Chase Secretary of the Treasury. He makes Seward the Secretary of State, and he makes Bates the Attorney General. That's why it's called Team of Rivals, because Lincoln's cabinet literally was a group of people all pulling in different directions. The three people that he picked for the highest positions in his government were all people that ran against him, that were a little bit bitter that they didn't get to be president, right? So that teaches something to us. And we learn Lincoln's reasoning for that. And we learn something. Maybe we learn that we should be kinder to our enemies than they are to us, right? We can take things from these books, learn new things, learn life lessons, right? So it talks about his approach to his loved ones and his colleagues. It also talks again about his journey through self-education. Now, Abraham Lincoln, I told you Benjamin Franklin was a working class kid. Abraham Lincoln grew up on the prairie. He grew up in the backwater, super rural part of the United States, not at all developed. He was born in a shack in Kentucky. At a young age, his family moved to Indiana. And from Indiana, later on, he would move to Illinois. And Abraham Lincoln sustained himself, as a young kid. He made money, and even as a, adolescent and as a young adult, he made money and sustained himself by working odd jobs. He would ferry things down the Mississippi, or he would, work he would work with other guys making railroads and things like that, right? In fact, he was known as the rail splitter. That was his initially condescending but eventually affectionate nickname while he was a presidential candidate and then while he was president, the rail splitter, right? Because that's what he did. He built railroads. And so we learned that despite all of this, despite this upbringing, which would lend itself to the idea that Abraham Lincoln is some uneducated, rural, knows nothing about politics, knows nothing about history, is uneducated. Despite all of that, Abraham Lincoln is one of our most educated, most eloquent presidents. How is that possible? Well, we learn in Team of Rivals, and of course, you can probably learn this in a multitude of other Lincoln biographies, that in fact, Abraham Lincoln was very, very motivated, right? So he got books. He had the Bible, he had the complete works of William Shakespeare, and any other book he could find, he would go and get it and read it. And he would read those books over and over and over again, right? In fact, there are stories of Lincoln entertaining whole parties by reciting big soliloquies from Shakespeare, because that became his world, right? When he wasn't doing work, he was reading and learning. Because of this, he became a very educated young man, a very eloquent young man. And on top of all of that, he basked in the skill of storytelling. He loved telling stories. So he developed his language, he developed his knowledge of the world by telling stories, listening to stories, reading, studying. And eventually he went on to become an apprentice lawyer. He became a lawyer. He ran for the state legislature in Illinois, and then later for the Congress. He ran for senator twice. He lost both of those, but he gained wide recognition around Illinois. He was basically the most important person in ensuring the creation of the Republican Party in the state of Illinois. And then he would go on to run for president, and despite being the guy that everybody expected to lose, because the other guys that I talked about, right, Seward, Chase, and Bates, those were the guys he ended up picking for his cabinet, and those were the guys that he ran against during the 1860 Republican primary. Everybody thought Lincoln can never beat any one of these guys, and he beat all three of them, right? So we see from Lincoln that it isn't true that you need, the most amazing grades in the best private high school in the world, and you need to go to an Ivy League. He proved all of that wrong. And I think that's still applicable today. I genuinely do. I genuinely believe that there is success to be found outside of the very, very narrow system that is set up out for you. Because these days you go to school and everybody tells you have to get a college degree. You have to, if you want to do science, you have to do this kind of thing. You have to be very narrow. You have to be a specialist. You can't diversify your interests. You have to study in college like 2 majors maybe that are both science, or 2 majors that are both liberal arts or something, but you can't do, a music degree and a science degree. You can't do that, right? That's what they want to tell you. That's what, society keeps telling you. That's what teachers tell students and guidance counselors tell students. And that's what we hear, that's what parents hear, and that's what they tell their children because they want their kids to succeed. But what Abraham Lincoln teaches us is no, that does not need to be the way that you do things. Ben Franklin teaches us the same thing, right? And so, we learn so much from heroes. We learn so much from what their experiences were in their life. And if we are willing to read and learn from them and take that information, we can learn life lessons without having to go through it the hard way. It gives us an advantage in life. It also gives us an idea about what maybe our plans should be. So heroes really do provide a formula to success. And that's not just for even big life, big life plans either, right? You can look at Abraham Lincoln, you can look at Benjamin Franklin, you can look at their overall arcs in their lives and say, okay, that's what I want to do. I want to emulate that. I want to learn from that. But even for smaller things, even for things that aren't huge life plans, you can learn from heroes. For example, Winston Churchill. Now, what does Winston Churchill teach us? He teaches us how to overcome our fears and find success. Okay, well, how does he do that? Well, here's an interesting fact about Winston Churchill. Despite the fact that he is now remembered as one of the greatest public speakers of all time, he was traditionally very afraid of public speaking. But he practiced, he worked, he studied. He would religiously write his speeches and go over them over and over and over again. Nobody else wrote his speeches. He wrote his speeches, and he would work on them and revise them time and again. And the result was that his speaking would be the rhetorical energizing factor that emboldened the United Kingdom to fight and resist the Nazis, even when Germany controlled almost the entire European continent. Right? So that's what heroes do. They show us how to plan for our lives. They show us what can be achieved in our lives. They show us what is truly possible, not just for even big things, but even small things, even overcoming fears. Our heroes fundamentally are the cartographers that have drawn the maps which point towards what we want to achieve in life. That is what heroes are. That is why heroes are important to society. But heroes aren't just that. They're not just maps, right? They're not just paths. They're not just formulas. They're even more. Because while heroes can teach you on an intellectual level, while they can teach you on a factual level, they can also inspire you emotionally. And that's the thing. That's what heroes do. They act as inspiration, which is the second reason that I believe heroes are incredibly important to our society. Now, doing amazing things in general requires inspiration, right? I mean, look at Bill Gates. Bill Gates, Microsoft, everybody knows the whole story. They started out in the garage, and now they're a multi-billion-dollar company. Bill Gates has been the richest man in the world multiple times, right? Do you think Bill Gates wasn't inspired? Do you think he didn't derive inspiration from anywhere? How about a great artist like Beethoven? Do you think Beethoven, he wrote 9 of the most amazing symphonies that music has ever seen. Do you think he wasn't inspired by something or someone? Even in Greek mythology, there's the Muses, which are basically goddesses of inspiration. I'm not a mythology person, so don't take my word for it that they're goddesses. They could be something else. But in reality, there's some truth to what the Greeks said. Because the Greeks are saying there are these sources of inspiration that all great artists derive their ideas and inspiration from, right? Great artists, great thinkers, people who achieve great things in general require inspiration. And that inspiration can come from a multitude of sources, and I think one of the best sources is heroes. Now, if you want to think about heroes, and if you want to think about our heroes, like the people that we in society generally accept as heroes, then you can even look at them and see that they were inspired by people. For example, Thomas Jefferson was very clearly inspired by the philosopher John Locke. Not just in terms of his rhetoric, but in terms of his beliefs, in terms of what John Locke wanted the world to be. And Thomas Jefferson said, I agree, and I'm inspired by your words, and I want to take that and make it a reality. And that's exactly what Thomas Jefferson did. And if you want to look at Abraham Lincoln, we've already brought up him. Well, Abraham Lincoln was inspired by George Washington, right? He revered George Washington as an ambassador, as an arbiter of democracy, of creating something new, right? A government of the people, by the people, for the people. That is what Abraham Lincoln saw in George Washington. That was his inspiration. Thomas Jefferson had John Locke. And today, our generation should look back and even learn from our heroes in that respect. We should learn from our heroes that it's important to have heroes, to have people to look up to have people to derive inspiration from. To achieve great things requires great motivation and patience, and our heroes, their stories, their works, and their messages can give us both. Now, heroes are both those who trail new paths for us to learn from and who inspire us to take up their mantles and work harder for the betterment of the world. And it is for the 2 reasons that I talked about. The fact that heroes are the ones who can show us the paths to success, even unconventional paths. They can show us the paths to success. And the fact that heroes can inspire us. This is why we as individuals need heroes, and why we as society need heroes. We as individuals need heroes to achieve great things, and society needs heroes because it needs people who can achieve great things. So fundamentally, heroes are important. But people like to criticize heroes. And it wouldn't be fair to discuss heroes without addressing those criticisms. So let's do that right now. Let's talk about what is the matter with heroes. Now, oftentimes people criticize heroes because they were not perfect, because they were imperfect individuals. And the idea that a lot of people have is, why is this person your hero? Why are you idolizing them? They'll use that word a lot. Why are you idolizing them when they did all of these things wrong? Right? People consider it as almost an attempt for people consider that idea to be whitewashing history. They see a person who has a hero and think you're trying to erase the reality of what this person was or did, or the impact of their actions. That's their argument that they're making. But I really disagree. And to show you why I disagree, well, first off, I'm going to start with a Shakespeare quote. So this Shakespeare quote comes from the play Julius Caesar, and it's after the assassination of Caesar at Caesar's funeral when Mark Antony goes up to speak. And Mark Antony, who was Caesar's right-hand man, in his speech, a few lines in, he ends up saying the line, "The evil that men do lives on after them. The good is oft interred within their bones." So the little message we get from that is that typically people will be remembered very strongly for the bad things they did, but sometimes it can be difficult to see the good things they did too, right? So in essence, that we tend to weigh the bad against something more heavily than we weigh the good. Okay, so keep that in mind. So I'm going to talk about a person who I consider a hero, but who is typically very controversial, and that is Thomas Jefferson. Right? And to be fair, the critiques of Thomas Jefferson as an individual are perfectly fair. They are perfectly fair. He owned slaves. He had a large plantation. He actively profited from his slaves. He proceeded to use that profit to fund an extravagant lifestyle, a lifestyle that resulted in basically bankruptcy after he died. And as a result, in order to pay off the debts, Thomas Jefferson's family had to sell a huge chunk of their slaves, which resulted in things like families being separated. And throughout Thomas Jefferson's life, slave families were separated. Children were separated from their parents, and that's horrendous. It's horrible. But the reality is that Thomas Jefferson is more than his sins. So to show you how important Thomas Jefferson is, to show you why I idolize him, I want to take you all the way back to the writing of the Declaration of Independence. So Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, the incredibly famous philosophical political document that is the basis for American democracy. He writes that the American Revolution happens, America gains independence from England. We all know the story. The American Revolution and its ideals would go on to inspire the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution, Thomas Jefferson was a huge supporter of it. And Thomas Jefferson, in fact, went over to France multiple times. And one of his, trips to France, he assisted in the writing of basically the French version of the Declaration of Independence, called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. So Jefferson assists in the writing of it. That declaration goes on to be the foundational ideological document, the foundational creed of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, a lot of people consider it a failure, right? Because you have the French Revolution, and they kick out the Bourbon monarchy with Louis XVI. Then Napoleon comes to power. He becomes an emperor, goes to war, creates the French Empire, and then eventually he's overthrown. He's exiled, and the person that replaces Napoleon is Louis XVIII. It's a reinstatement of the Bourbon monarchy. And then afterwards, Napoleon comes back and tries to regain power, but he fails. And so, all in all, we have this incredibly important moment in French history, which you see the rise of democracy on the continent of Europe, which is historically just it's historically almost entirely monarchy, right? It's just monarchies, it's kings, it's emperors, it's this, that. But, you have this moment, this blip in European history where we see democracy flounder. And it got so close to succeeding. But the French Revolution comes back. And there's more revolutions. There's more people who want the ideals of Locke and Jefferson and Voltaire. There's more people who want to kick out the monarch. And so you're going to see in French history, you see multiple revolutions, all of whom have the same principles and ideals behind them, ideals and principles that were fundamentally, created, they were, the rhetoric behind these kinds of ideals and revolutions was truly formalized by Thomas Jefferson. But it gets better. Because one of these revolutions, one that happened in the 1800s, would go on to inspire the French musical Les Mis. Very popular musical. There's an English version too, which is also very popular. They made a movie in the early 2010s. I think maybe 2012, 2013, something like that. But you have Les Mis. In Les Mis, there's the song, Do You Hear the People Sing? Which is, I think, one of the most famous songs from the entire musical. And the whole principle of it is it's this battle cry for the people to march onto the streets, for the people to stand up and stand up for their rights. And it's simultaneously a call to the people at the very top, the monarchs and the wealthy, It's a call to them saying, do you hear us? Do you see us? Because we're here and we expect more than the ill treatment we have received. So that song, Do You Hear the People Sing, was sung in 2019 by protesters in Hong Kong who were protesting against the infringements of China on Hong Kong sovereignty. So in an indirect way, Thomas Jefferson would go on to inspire these protesters fighting for democracy in their home. And that's the thing, is that Thomas Jefferson, despite his sins, despite his flaws, created the rhetoric that is still used to fight for democracy and to defeat authoritarianism. Thomas Jefferson created the words that are now used to uphold global democracy. That is what Thomas Jefferson did. You want even more proof about how important Thomas Jefferson is? Look at Afghanistan. Now, when President Joe Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, it was viewed as one of the biggest foreign policy disasters. I mean, it's certainly one of the biggest ones in the 21st century, probably one of the biggest ones since Vietnam. It was viewed as a huge disaster. But as a result of Joe Biden pulling out of Afghanistan, a lot of people started to ask the question, why were we in Afghanistan in the first place? Why did we just spend 20 years and billions upon billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, funding a place that the moment we left, any semblance of rights and democracy was abandoned, the Taliban regained control, corruption in government exploded in a mere matter of days? Why is that? Why were we spending all this time there? And the one phrase I heard so many times when people were having these discussions about why did we just do all of this, the one phrase I heard over and over again was, we shouldn't have gone into Afghanistan expecting to establish a Jeffersonian democracy. Jeffersonian democracy. That was the word they used. Because that is the best word to describe the kind of humanitarian, human rights, free speech, freedom of press, the kind of democracy that everybody in the world admires. At least everybody who is aligned with democratic values admires. That is what Jefferson created. Words are powerful. And the fact is, Thomas Jefferson, along with John Locke, they created and formalized the words, and especially Thomas Jefferson formalized the words that went on to inspire massive change in the world, to where we began the 20th century with kings and emperors, continued the 20th century with fascists and military dictators, and are now in a place where a really good chunk of the world is democracies. And where for an authoritarian to live, for an authoritarian to remain in power, he has to pretend like it's a democracy. Because in reality, if he doesn't pretend like it's a democracy, the people are going to revolt. People want democracy. That is what Thomas Jefferson did. He changed the paradigm. In 250 years, a paradigm shift has occurred in the world that now we want democracies. And I'm going to give you one more piece of evidence about how powerful words are and how powerful Thomas Jefferson's words are. So, John Locke wrote that people have a right to life, liberty, and property. Those are very famous words. Even more famous words are Thomas Jefferson's words, which say, we have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, a lot of people will look at Thomas Jefferson's words and go, wow, you really just lifted John Locke there. You really stole from this guy. Like, congratulations, Tom. I thought you were better than that. No, but it's actually kind of a joke, especially in U.S. history circles. People are like, Thomas Jefferson kind of just stole from Locke. But I read actually a different theory. And the different theory is not that Thomas Jefferson just stole from John Locke and then changed property to pursuit of happiness so that he could copy while also being more poetic. Like, the theory is that that wasn't what happened. The theory is Thomas Jefferson wanted to enshrine the same rights and values as Locke by saying life, liberty, and property, but he knew that if he said property, then all the slave-holding states would take that as an indication that in the document that fundamentally outlined the rights and values of Americans and American citizens, and frankly, Democrats, I say Democrats with a small d, then then they would take that as an indication that we have the right to own slaves. Because Thomas Jefferson said so. All the other founding fathers signed that document. They all said so. We have a right to own slaves, right? That's what they would have taken it as. But no, Thomas Jefferson knew that and said, I'm going to change it to pursuit of happiness so that there's no mention of property. And then as a result, the slave owners will not have that ammunition. In fact, we see something very similar in the Constitution where the word slavery doesn't appear at all. And a lot of people who are, kind of skeptical of the founding fathers, they'll go, they were trying to whitewash the fact that there was slavery. They were trying to pretend like it didn't exist. But in reality, they knew it existed. But the very smart founding fathers, the James Madisons of the world, they knew if we put in slavery, if we put the word in, then it's going to look like the Constitution sanctioning slavery. We can't put the word in there, and they didn't. And if you go to the 1850s and 1860s, when you look at Abraham Lincoln, the words he said, what he talked about in regards to his opposition to the expansion of slavery into new territories, what he said was, look at the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't mention slavery. It doesn't mention the whole property thing. Look at Constitution. It doesn't mention slavery. So what in reality Thomas Jefferson did was he created a time bomb, sank it deep into the Declaration of Independence, to where the end of slavery, he basically set that time bomb for the end of slavery, to where the end of slavery was inevitable, to where no one could look back on the Declaration of Independence and say this sanctioned slavery. And if you want proof that that was in Thomas Jefferson's mind, that he didn't want slavery in America, look at the fact that he actually wrote a portion of the Declaration of Independence that full-on attacked the institution of slavery. But he was forced to remove it because people were afraid that his words would go on to make the southern states, which say Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, they were afraid that those states would leave the Union. So they couldn't do that. But that's what Thomas Jefferson wanted to put. Thomas Jefferson was opposed to slavery, as philosophically opposed to slavery. He obviously wasn't opposed to owning slaves, because he definitely did that. But he was opposed philosophically to slavery and did everything he could in his power to lay the rhetorical foundations for the end of slavery. And lo and behold, that is exactly what happened. That is the power of words. And Thomas Jefferson is fundamentally the greatest wordsmith in American history. And as a result, his impact lives on in positive ways. Because not only did Thomas Jefferson do all of that, but he has gone on to inspire other individuals. Other people in American history, other people who have done great things, look at Thomas Jefferson and are inspired. Now, I've done no great things, but I can assure you Thomas Jefferson has inspired me. And he's inspired me to have faith in democracy. He's inspired me to look at the democratic system and look at democratic norms and hold them in reverence and fight for them. That's what that is fundamentally from Jefferson. That inspiration to fight for democracy is Jefferson. And for every person he inspires to do even one good thing, even one little good thing, or for every mind he inspires to say democracy is beneficial, human rights are beneficial, for every person that he inspires to say things like that, to think things like that, to take actions based on those thoughts, his legacy gets all the better. So yes, he has sinned. Yes, he owned slaves. But slavery is no more, in part thanks to Thomas Jefferson. Yes, the way he owned his slaves was atrocious in terms of the psychological torment of separating families. But simultaneously, he has brought the world together under the idea that democracy can work. Europe used to be monarchies, and now it is democracies. And it is in a good chunk because of Jefferson. But still, I'm going to be honest, a lot of people are not going to be convinced. They still want perfect heroes. And so I want to talk to you about one more idea, just one, about why I don't think that that's possible, and why, in fact, imperfect people, they need to be our heroes, and why we couldn't possibly have perfect heroes. Here's why. Let's look at a person who over 1 billion people consider a perfect individual. Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is revered today. Even people who aren't Christians revere Jesus Christ. Muslims view Jesus Christ not as necessarily a prophet, but certainly, he was not like the Messiah, but they certainly view him as like a prophet, right? They view him as incredibly important. He's important in their religion too. And people who are Jewish, they have reverence for Jesus Christ. They may not believe that he's the Son of God, but they have reverence for him. And so, even people outside the Christian faith revere Jesus Christ, and people within the Christian faith believe that he is a perfect individual. Now, in theory, if the whole idea that we can have perfect heroes can hold up, then the vast, vast majority of people who you're going to ask, who is your hero? They're going to say, Jesus Christ. At least if you live in a country that's predominantly Christian, right? You're going to hear that all the time. Oh, my hero is Jesus Christ. But you don't hear that very often. Some people, he is definitely your hero. But for a lot of people, he's not. And why is that? Because here's the thing. It is really, 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 really difficult to relate to an individual who is perfect. To relate to an individual who is, according to like 1 billion people, the Son of God, right? It is really hard to relate to that. It's just difficult. But, you can relate to imperfection. Because that's one more thing that heroes give us. We're all flawed. We are all flawed. And heroes show us that we can do good things and achieve good things and be good people despite our flaws. I'm an imperfect person, but so was Abraham Lincoln. And maybe I can do good things too. Just like my heroes did. And just like your heroes did. Because that's the thing, is that despite the fact that our heroes may not be perfect, what they show us is how to overcome those flaws, how to achieve success in life. And they inspire us to achieve that success and do good things. And so, coming to the very conclusion of this, I'm going to tell you how Benjamin Franklin has inspired me, in particular with this podcast. Because Benjamin Franklin began his own newspaper. He also organized a debate club in Philadelphia. And he wrote his memoirs and Poor Richard's Almanac. And as a result, he was able to share his thoughts and ideas with the world. Right? And so here I am, with the full acknowledgement that I'm not as smart as Benjamin Franklin, but with the inspiration from him to take a cue that maybe, if not betterment of the world, maybe it's just therapeutic to be able to share your thoughts with the world. And that is how Benjamin Franklin has inspired the very thing I'm doing right now. That's why we need heroes. As individuals, as a society. Because they show us the path to achieving great things. And because they inspire us to achieve great things. And because despite their flaws, they show us that we can overcome those flaws. That despite our imperfections, we can be something great. Thank you for listening to New Age Renaissance Man, the show about everything intellectual. I've been Alex T.Q. There are new episodes of the show every Wednesday, so remember to subscribe to the New Age Renaissance Man channel on YouTube and follow me on Instagram. And if you enjoyed this podcast, if you've learned a single thing from it, if you've maybe even changed your perspective a little bit, then please subscribe or follow. It means a lot to me. Like or rate or whatever, like this video or podcast, or rate it on perhaps Spotify or whatever you're listening to this on, because it really, really means a lot to me and everything I'm doing. Have a great day.